coming here, a little bit early in the morning. I think this is the first talk of the day, if I'm right. Yeah. So for those here today, welcome, and for people who are listening online, thank you for tuning in as well. So I'm from Safework New South Wales. I'm an inspector. My name is Owen Gendek, and we just thought we would come here today just to talk about any recent changes that have been made to work health and safety legislation recently. So look, I did come here yesterday, and it was actually great to see just the modern technology that a lot of these businesses have. It's really interesting for us to see as a regulator, and we just thought we're going to talk a bit, basically 3 big changes to the legislation that I think may affect most of the people here. So just clicker. Oh, this is great. Got the clicker to work.
It's just catching up.
Yeah. Okay, we're just, okay, apologies for that. So, really just the 3 main things we want to talk about are these. So, first one I just want to touch on is just audiometric testing. It just came in at the start of the year, so that's hearing testing requirements for workers wearing hearing protection. Then I'll touch a bit about workplace exposure standards. So there's been a reduction to the exposure standard for welding fumes. So I'll just talk a little bit about that. And then the last point, I'll touch a bit about psychosocial hazards. Because as you know, work health and safety, it's not just physical harm, but we also look at mental harm as well. And just your obligations as an employer to make sure that you're managing the risk for psychosocial as well. Okay, so the first one here, audiometric testing. So basically, there was an exemption in place, but then from the 1st of January this year, that exemption's been lifted. So now there's this requirement for, I have this term here, PCBU. So for those who don't know, PCBU is just a term for a person conducting a business or undertaking. So that's businesses. You have an obligation now, just making sure that when workers are frequently required to wear hearing protection, that audiometric testing is done. Okay, so for those who are familiar with things like respirators, when there's fit testing requirements, it's kind of similar to that. So it's just about seeing how effective the hearing protection is when a worker is wearing it. Okay, so the main point is the audiometric testing, it is not a control measure in and of itself. The hearing protection is, but the audiometric testing is in place, just making sure that it is effective and the workers aren't subject to hearing loss over time. Okay, so just pointed out, so regular hearing tests provided, frequently required by the employer to wear hearing protection to control noise that exceeds those noise exposure standards. And I'll touch a bit about the exposure standards in a second. So when it comes to the frequency of testing to be done, so we put here, so the first point, so within 3 months of the worker commencing work. And the reason why we say that is just to establish a baseline of the worker's hearing when they commence work, all right? And then after that, every 2 years. So then that data from every 2 years is compared to the baseline just to see if there's been any negative effect on that worker's hearing. So what should you do? So I just thought we would list, kind of like an A to Z of how you should be managing noise exposure in your workplace and how to manage it as best as you can. So really the first point, you have a duty there to identify noise sources at your workplace. So seeing if there's any items of plant that are generating a lot of noise. Is there work activity that's creating a lot of peak noise, banging, clanging, things like that. So then make a reasonable attempt at assessing the impact of that noise. So, okay, you've established that there is a source of noise. Let's say we got this item of plant for an example, but how bad is it? So this is where you look into, I listed the reference in the regulation, clause 56. So if you look at that, that talks about the noise exposure standard. So for those unfamiliar with noise, there are 2 exposure standards, maximum allowances for noise. So there's one which is like your peak noise, stuff that's a big bang or a clang. But then there's the continuous noise. So think of a really loud, noisy plant that's going for a long time. So for the one that's over a long time, for 8 hours, you can only have a maximum of 85 dBA. And then with peak noise, it's 140 dBc. So that's listed in the regulation, and we've got some guidance material on that online, which I'll show you a bit later on for you to look at that yourself. So once you've identified, okay, this bit of plant, for instance, is generating a lot of noise and it goes over those numbers that I was talking about, you've got to control it, okay? So with your general management of risk, seek to eliminate that risk, okay? If you can't eliminate that risk, you know what you have to do? You have to minimize it as best as you can, okay? So hearing protection, that's your lowest form of control measure, okay? That's PPE. Seek to minimize it using what's known as a hierarchy of controls, okay? Try and introduce some engineering controls, you know, some encapsulation perhaps, or think of other ways to, you know, separate items of plant. If you've got loads of bits of plant in the one area, is there a way to isolate that? So you have to go through this process. But then also listed, you know, consult with your workers. You know, your workers are out there all the time working with this stuff. So again, input from them. And also again, input of how the audiometric testing will impact them as well. So just at the bottom there, just got some, you know, got the code of practice at the bottom. So I really like that code of practice. It kind of spells out in a bit more detail what you need to do with managing noise. But then we've got the links there to our website and our number 131050, so you can give that a call as well. All right, so next one. So I want to just talk a bit about welding fumes. So this one's been a big change. So the exposure standard for welding fume has actually gone down from 5 milligrams per cubic meter to 1 milligram per meter cubed. So actually quite a reduction there. And why that is just there's been more recent research that's been put out suggests that lowering the exposure standard just ensures the health and safety of those workers. Okay, so I just want to explain briefly, just at the top there, if you can see it. So just basically what a definition of the exposure standard is when it comes to the airborne contaminants. Okay, so stuff that's getting, you know, sent into the air and the worker's breathing in, the exposure standard just sets the maximum of how much you can breathe in during that shift. That's basically what it is. All right, so, and in our legislation, we have clauses in place to make sure that as part of your work, that exposure standard is not to be exceeded. So, okay, that's gone now. So then, I was talking about the research that's come out. So it was identified for welding fumes to be listed as a group 1 carcinogen. So that played a big part in the reduction of this exposure standard. But I just also want to let you know, with welding, it's not just welding fume that you should be concerned about. Look at other risks as well. So think about noise that I was saying before in the welding process. Think about excessive heat, for instance. All these things play a part in the welding process. So yeah, further information, just sort of list the relevant clauses in the regulation. So I did say earlier, so that clause 49 is there, just ensuring that those exposure standards aren't exceeded. And how do you ensure that? Well, it's usually done by lots of measurements and samples taken by some professionals. It can be a review of what chemicals or what metals you're dealing with. But there's professionals known as occupational hygienists that do a lot of this sampling with their equipment. You've got clause 50, just making sure you monitor those airborne contaminant levels if you're unsure whether it is exceeded or not. And then part 3.1 is just the general, just how do you manage risk to health and safety. That's what I said with noise when it comes about seek to eliminating the risk, and if you can't eliminate it, minimize it as far as reasonably practicable. That's what part 3.1 is all about. So listed some just information for you in the future. So Safework New South Wales asked, we've got a code of practice on welding processes, so be sure to have a look at that. We also have some information on our website, 131050 once again. But also Safework Australia has some news about the change of the workplace exposure standards. Now, just thought I'd let you know, exposure standards do change over time, so it's good for you to be up to date with anything new that's been put out. So I do encourage you to routinely check websites such as Safework Australia for any updates that come through. And then just last bit, Weld Australia, that's a good industry body that you can have a look at as well for further information. All right, so last point I just want to let you know about is about psychosocial hazards. So I did say earlier on, so it's not just the physical harm and physical health and safety, but for businesses, they need to look at mental health and safety as well. So that's what psychosocial is all about. So back in 2022, so in October, there were some changes made to the regulation about the management of these psychosocial risks. Okay, so they're from clauses 55A to D, but we also have a code of practice that helps list the obligations as well. So it talks about the definition of a psychosocial hazard and risk, how to clarify the obligations to manage those hazards. And then 55D talks about implementing control measures. And you see how this kind of looks a bit familiar, those last 2 points? And that's because it's just your general management of risk to health and safety. Doesn't matter if it's physical, doesn't matter if it's psychosocial. Seek to eliminate those risks. And if you can't eliminate those risks, minimize it using that hierarchy of controls. So just put the definition up on there. So there's some examples. So exposure to traumatic events, bullying, workplace violence, harassment, inadequate worker support, they can all coincide into generating a psychosocial risk in your workplace. Okay, and then just further information. So I did mention the code of practice that was out in May 2021. But we also just recently, maybe in the last few weeks, released a document on designing work to manage psychosocial risk. So please have a look at that as well. It goes into a bit more detail.